Let me just briefly introduce Dr. Jeremy Horne. He's President-emeritus of the Southwest Area Division of the American Association for Advancement of Science, and he currently retired in San Felipe, Baja California, Mexico, doing research and writing in the areas of logic as the language of order in the universe, which is an ongoing 40-year project. As well, Dr. Horne taught many grad courses in political science and technology, delivered many presentations on the philosophy of scientific methods for the American Association for the Advancements of Science and Quantum Mind conferences. Also has been reviewer for various journals about the structure and process in binary space, consciousness studies, systems theory, and philosophy of science. Also, he's a member of several professional organizations such the American Association of Advancement of Science, which, by the way, is the world's largest general scientific society, where he was president of its Southwest Area Division, Bioelectromagnetic Society, Institute of Electric and Electronics Engineers, where he's a voting member of Fiber Optic Technical Advisory Group. Finally, Dr. Jeremy Horne earned his PhD in philosophy at the University of Florida, Gainesville, his Master of Science in Political Science at New Haven, Connecticut, and his Bachelor in Art in International Relations at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. He has been a member of the Pi Kappa Pi National Academic Honor Society, and his name was included in several Who and Who directories. Dr. Horne, it's a pleasure to have you here today.
As mentioned, my background's in philosophy. And I kind of take a different view from a lot of folks, and you probably heard me this morning, kind of looking at the larger picture of things in our world. Philosophers, hopefully, presumably, ask a couple of central questions: who we are and what we're about. I think it's rather interesting in the American schools that philosophy is conspicuously absent. You don't find it as a requirement. You find these kids going through and they learn a lot of things. They learn a lot of techne. This morning, my criticism, we talk about the need to satisfy the wishes of employers. Education must satisfy the wishes of employers. What about education? For education's sake, learning for learning's sake, who we are and what we're about. Well, on the heels of that, I've come to think over the years that there are deep structures, innate structures. And we're going to see some of these. I could pick out just about any topic, I think, and go through it and show where those structures are. And here we have interdisciplinary communication. As I go through this, I want to try to point to some of the structures and some of the implications of not doing an interdisciplinary, taking an interdisciplinary approach. Obviously, we're here. This is who I am. A copy of this presentation can be at this website if you want to copy it down. Najee will have it, it'll be on the website and stuff like that. I have to give you the latest copy of this thing. And I did not put the blue cow in this time. That's a joke. It's a dialect cow. So what is it? We have interdisciplinary, intradisciplinary, cross-disciplinary. We really haven't talked about cross-disciplinary much here. I think we all know what this is. I only had 20, 25 minutes to do this. By that time, the tea and the coffee will have caught up too, so that will be my timer. And if I go a little bit fast, if I take too long, somebody heave a shoe at me or something. So I'm a philosopher after all. Interdisciplinary, basically, if we think we know what that is, it's basically taking knowledge from one field, such as engineering, and trying to relate it to something like literature. So we take something that's two disparate studies and trying to relate them to each other. I'll get to more of that. And interdisciplinary is something within the discipline. Cross-disciplinary is translating one discipline in terms of another. Very briefly. there they are, and we have a publication out. This is an example I want to take, like hello, interdisciplinary. How are you going to say hello in 1,000 different languages, in essence? Interdisciplinary, as I said, basically something within the discipline. Cross-disciplinary, as I said. Again, running through these things fairly fast. Again, you can get the copy on the web or wherever. Now, one thing, a quick note on this. We had last year Bob Baker, an astrophysicist. And he goes through and derives conclusions about the cosmos and on and on and on. And okay, well, that's the astrophysics way of doing it. I'm wondering, and I have thought of this, and I think that the logician can come to essentially the same conclusions as the astrophysicist about the nature of our universe and structures. Again, it emphasizes deep structures. I think a lot of these disciplines can arrive at essentially the same conclusions about who we are and what we're about, ideally, because of those innate structures. Those innate structures, as if it were, permeate all the disciplines. It is truly a Tower of Babel. I do like that analogy, where you start out when there's a commonality of understanding, and somebody throws a monkey wrench into the works, and gee, everybody can't talk to each other after that. They're talking about the same bloody thing, but in different ways. Now, I'll get into that. I'll give a quick example, and I'm not very organized because of the time limit. There's something called the Heisenberg Set of problems. And they basically is you cannot measure position and momentum at the same time. I would argue that it's essentially the same kind of thing as Gödel. I would argue it also is the same thing as the problem between inductive and deductive logic. And I'm going to get into some of this as we go through. Basically, in terms of, we have something in terms of particular, in terms of a general. And something is seen in terms of, I'll get to that in a second, but that's an example of a deep structure. I can go into, we can look at some of the publications and stuff like that. But that, I'm running too damn fast. All right. What is a discipline? I've always wondered, what is a discipline? It's kind of like, is a mother spanking a child? Well, actually, in some ways, yes. You go through school and you learn the drill. You learn to study, you learn to concentrate, you do all these other things. And discipline really is what it is. You are focused, you absorb information, process and stuff like that, and you become very directed in what you do. In that sense, it is a discipline. So the professor is pretty much spanking you as you go through the university. So there is some parallel. Focus, maturity, skill, knowledge, area of expertise. But there are two problems. And they have to do with boundary. And again, I'm going to bring up the structure again. What is the boundary between deductive and inductive, for example? And I'll ask basically, how do you construct a deductive system? This is what Gödel basically is, again, is expressed by Gödel. Incomplete. Nobody in this room could tell me how they construct a deductive system except they did it subjectively. Axioms, where do they come from? For example, where do you get the stuff that you draw conclusions with? From where? It's called the problem of induction. Again, it's the same thing. I'm just expressing it differently. It's that innate structure. There it is again, rearing its ugly head. So in a discipline, where is the boundary? I defy you to tell me the difference between biophysics, physics, and stuff like that. They're all in terms of each other. Where is the boundary in any discipline? I defy anybody to give me some algorithm for defining a boundary. If you look at a color spectrum like that, you tell me where the blue is, somebody. You're not going to be able to tell me that at all. Anything. And it gets right back down into that uncertainty business. You reduce everything to a Planck scale. And there you have it. It's all uncertain. And if you want to look at the Copenhagen interpretation, it's essentially the individual basically imposing the limits on whatever they see. Again, there it is. I'm saying the same damn thing over and over and over again, 1,000 different ways. And all these disciplines are going to come, it's essentially run into this problem somewhere along the line. What I'm saying is interdisciplinary. It's the innate structure peeking itself through all these areas. Physics are going to come up with that problem. Literatures are going to come up. Art, everything else. It's the same thing. It's all us. I'll get into that in a minute. Oh, come on. So how does one determine what the discipline is? If you look at, Worf really didn't say this, but a lot of people accuse him of saying this, that language determines the content. Whatever words you use are going to describe which control the content of the conversation. I would argue that the complexity of explanation is proportional to their specialization. The more specialized you are, the more complex. That's pretty obvious. But all these are defined in terms of a context. Physics is defined in terms of whatever it is not. I'll get to that in a second. I'm running, all right. Where are the boundaries and who sets them in any discipline? Where are the boundaries? I kind of alluded to that before. I would argue, as I said yesterday, the day before, that really a discipline in the ultimate analysis is an ego. That's one of the things that controls it. What is my discipline? I can come up with something like I have a specialty area using binary logic to do blah, 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 and I can give a long description of it, and that's a discipline. Nobody wouldn't know what the hell I'm talking about. I shot my hypercube paper around to several people. They don't even know what the hell it is. I look at it, it is specialized. And I have to sit there and explain 1,000 years what that thing is about. So I can create my own little discipline. You've heard of the word neologism. And that's kind of an extreme case of what a discipline is. People create their own little vocabulary, their own little worlds, and there they are. In the ultimate analysis, in the extreme case, the most extreme discipline is one's view of themselves. Actually, we had a conversation a little while ago about a paper. You publish a paper, and what was the little thing about the individual saying, okay, I publish a paper so only I understand it. That's the highest quality paper of all. And so if you say that I publish a paper that only I can understand, but that's the highest quality, that is nothing but an affirmation of one's ego. But if I have a shared ego, I publish a paper so 1 million people can understand it, then you have a kind of community of ego, then there's your community. So in the extreme case, a discipline is a reflection of an ego. At a higher level, if I have a discipline, let's say like physics, it's a reflection of collective egos, what the physicists think ego is. One doesn't think so, take a look at the various specialty societies. If I'm somebody in American literature, for example, and I want to get into the American Institute of Physics, try it. So basically, discipline in essence is an ego, be it an individual one or collective one. This is what I referred to earlier about innate structures. And I maintain this problem just creeps in everywhere about the issue of boundary. And we observe the colors that we want to observe. We observe the boundaries that we want to observe. We set the limits of what the discipline is. How do we do this? The jargon. I can write a paper and it's so abstruse, contains words that nobody understands, neologisms, whatever I want to put into the thing. But that's what a lot of disciplinarians will do. They create a special vocabulary. I'll get to that in a second, what that vocabulary is supposed to do. But one creating the discipline, you've heard this, knowledge is power. The professor lords it over you. If you don't learn that particular vocabulary, you're on the out. You learn that vocabulary, you learn the language, and then you are the discipline. It's like a little club. You're admitted after you learn the words, and you learn the drill. I would argue this, and I put this in last night. I said this the other day. This gets to Grandin's idea about the complexity. I would argue the way we are going, and again, I want you to keep in the mind the background of what the philosopher thinks. who we are and what we're about. You subdivide things so much, and I would argue, here's an innate structure for you. You get in cosmology, what do you do when you subdivide something down to Planck's scale? You get down to that uncertainty. I would argue with knowledge, it's almost the same way. You keep subdividing and create all this knowledge, all this information, data, God knows what else. We are so bombarded with it. I'm wondering if there is not an information entropy. The very physical thing, you talk about the technology, being able to handle this thing. Let's take this thing, and I can describe this. You all had the exercise defining in 10 pages, writing 10 pages on the head of a pin. It's easy. I can write 1,000,000 pages. I can write infinite pages on a pin. All I need to do is go with the history of it, and then I can just tag one word with another bunch of words describing those, and on. It's infinite. Now, what happens physically? If I start doing this, I create so much information. I know I remember this thing. I got a memory stick here that's what, 8 gigs. You know that SanDisk has got 164 gigs. They're going to have a terabyte in one of these damn things here in another few years. And you're going to have so much information, just a physical number of words, the physical number of things, computers, God knows, iPads, I don't know what else. You'll have so many things that you're going to deal with just to deal with information. I mean, physically. Not going to have the bloody time to even filter it. You'll have filters of filters of filters of filters. I would argue that this is very parallel. It's very, I think there is an innate structure where there will be an information entropy. That there'll be kind of like a heat death of information. That ultimately, if the way we're going, we may not be able to process it. I think we need to drop back as a philosopher and say, really, what is it? And I think this is I like the Buddhist approach in many ways. A lot of Buddhists kind of become Buddhists from the Western world because I've seen this happen. You've seen it too. Where people are so inundated with all this crap. Like, I can't take it anymore. They go running. They get the hell out. Why do you think people escape to the country? They want to sit in a nice peaceful cabin, go back to the 13th century, and sit there by the peaceful fire. It simplifies things. After a while, you get so much of this stuff, how you lose track of it. You lose track of the philosophy, who we are and what we're about. I'm not saying that don't do this. I'm not saying we shouldn't do this. But I think we need to be mindful of what we're doing. It's like when you're saying the complexity, how we do it, they're the shouldas and the oughtas. You've got a lot of shouldas and the oughtas. I agree with you. I sure as hell agree with you. We should do something about the environment. We should do this. We should do that. Realistically, given you're a statistician too. Realistically, do you think that's going to happen? Realistically. I know, and I'm the curmudgeon of this whole conference. And I kind of throw a shoe at everything. I think somebody needs to throw some shoes. We need to be really self-critical. It is a dialectical process. The discipline needs to criticize itself. I'm a Hegelian too. I could let that cat out of the bag too. So, these are kind of mechanical slides. Knowledge through naming and reference. That's what we do. We name things. So what we do is this with the discipline, and the disciplines have a purpose. For example, platypus. Everybody knows what a platypus, but you try to explain that to someone who doesn't know what a platypus is. Or take something really weird in some discipline and explain that. So what we do, I'm running through this very quickly. All we do basically is we use keywords. I was explaining earlier to some folks, okay, we all have our disciplines, we all have our specialties. How do we come through there? Got years of university experience, blah, 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 blah. But when one disciplinarian A talks with B, it's a few keywords, bang, about 4 or 5 words. Oh, I know what you're talking about, bang. And what you're doing, you've compressed 5 or 6 years of coursework into about 4 or 5 words. Hypothetically, you can bring anybody else at that point, but you're going to go through the long route. Through all the courses and everything else. So basically the disciplines have a use. They're shorthand. You communicate a few ideas, a few words, a bunch of ideas, maybe a few words, bang, there you are. It's a shorthand. And that's why we go to universities and stuff like that. We learn the shorthand. So hypothetically, I explain one word in terms of 1,000 million other words and ultimately get there. And this is basically what I call it a word net. Alfred Jules' air, I'm sure a lot of people have heard of Alfred Jules' air, and basically language is simply a network. We go from one word in terms of a bunch of other words, in terms of a bunch of those other words, and blah, 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 and ultimately we may be able to come full circle or full web, whatever it is, back to the original point, and we can keep going through the web. That's in essence what disciplines are all about. Disciplines are shorthand ways I can get from word 1 to word 1b, bang, like that. Otherwise, I had to go through the whole round robin and through all the other words, all the disciplines and all the years of study and stuff like that. That's what the function of a discipline is. But what happens, the problem is you keep subdividing and subdividing and subdividing until you get down to, as I said, analogous to the Planck scale. And you ultimately have a heat death of information. That's basically getting into the web of language. I'm just going to run through this fairly quickly because I imagine the time's running. Did Worf, just to kind of correct a little point, a lot of people think Worf said that language creates the idea. Worf really didn't say that. This is what he really did say, basically that there's an underlying consciousness that gives rise to the language. Then in turn, from that dialectically, that language then conveys the ideas, and we can shape people's thoughts by that language from that point, but it's got to originate some point. A word has to originate from some point in our consciousness. Where that comes from, I don't know. That is one of the problems of induction. That's Worf anyway. All right. We have these other issues about communicating among disciplinarians. It's a Platonic concept. How do you represent something? And it gets into one discipline in terms of the other, in terms of how you map one discipline in terms of the other. I'm just kind of running, these are somewhat mechanical. The time for me is somewhat compressed, but I just want to run through these very briefly. We have the problem of representation of what is real in the discipline. Does a discipline really represent what there is? And I think there is a danger in a discipline running off with itself where it doesn't really represent much anymore. It becomes reified into something else. The discipline of disciplines. How much time do I have? I'm really bad on time. I know I have to compress this.
You must curtail your words.
That's what I thought. All right. I got to shorten this. So this will be up on the web. I did want to get to those issues of where the disciplines go ultimately if we keep subdividing and subdividing and subdividing. It's more pretty much the same thing. Now, can we get all this, can we make all three of these things coalesce? Oh, what happened here? Well, nothing. All right, what is another nature of a discipline? And this gets into the business of cross-disciplinary stuff. One discipline in terms of the other discipline. This gets into some dialectics, and people who know me kind of know where this goes. Basically, something is seen in terms of what it isn't. So what is physics? Physics supposedly is what physics is not. The things that are not physics then give rise to the physics. It's a dialectical thing. And yeah, this is the dialectics. And I think we've gone through, I won't bother you with that. And that's essentially, what I'm trying to get toward is a unity of the disciplines. Now each discipline is, there are no boundaries, as I said, but let's say there were some kind of boundaries. You say physics is different than chemistry, different, whatever. However, I think the role of the interdisciplinary approach is the dialectic approach. We say that these disciplines are in terms of each other, and ultimately we get this unity of these disciplines. That's pretty much what I'm leading to. If I had more time, I'd be able to give much more explanation, so I'm cutting a lot out. That's pretty much the law. Now, We have, and this is not very well seen. I can hardly even see. What is interdisciplinary? I can see this thing. I have to refresh this thing. We have the analogy between the corpus callosum and the Odysseans. Can you see this thing? And so what is the, I want to get this thing here right. Okay, your left brain, we have, all right, here's more of the dialectic. We have a left brain in terms of operating with the right brain through the corpus callosum. We have the logical, the left, the particular, in terms of the artistic, the general, in terms of the right. Now, again, here's the innate structure coming through. We have a particular in terms of a general, the particular being the logic, and the general being the artistic and the creative and so forth. We have the dialectic pretty much built into our brains, something in terms of the other. So there's not, again, I'm not going to read all the print in there. Again, I'm going very fast. It's on the presentation, but I just wanted to call that to your attention, that there's another evidence of this innate structure, something that philosophers like. So what I say all right, to the cross-disciplinary thing, I mentioned this earlier about how you can take one discipline and then reveal the contents of another discipline through it. So example, let's say with like the physics and the logic, or let's say with literature. Can you do the same thing with a literature and describe what's poetically with something that's going on in chemistry, for example, and convey the same idea? And that's, you get into some of the problems of mapping, but I'll just rush through that very quickly. All right. Gets more into the general stuff that I started with, and how much more time do I have? 2 minutes, a minute, somebody raise their finger. Okay, all right. Disciplines aside and so forth, it gets back into my complaint, admittedly, about we have to get this appreciation for why we even have a discipline. I can go into all the technical aspects about disciplines and what they're not, and what we should do, what you should do, and stuff like that. But I think the thing, it keeps coming back to having an appreciation for what disciplines are, why we have them. What are we really doing with all this stuff? I see all these conferences, you read all these journals, and read all this stuff, and we get caught up with the particular. And I think a lot of us lose track of the larger picture. Again, the old philosophy, but people like to avoid that. They get very uncomfortable with this. And I have an exercise with the students. I say, you want to know what a philosopher is, what a philosophy is? What I suggest you do is stand in front of a mirror. And it's very interesting what happens. I've heard fairly recently, this is an old exercise out of the East Asia. Where you look at the mirror, and you look at the mirror, and look at the mirror, and do that. It's an experiment. You keep looking at it. After a while, with a lot of people, what happens is rather interesting that you kind of get outside of yourself. It's almost like listening to a tape recorder. You're listening to that voice that is yours on the tape recorder. But what happens, very curiously, you get outside of yourself. And you read Hegel's phenomenology, and this is, in essence, the first part of the phenomenology. The individual and the individual's other. Hegel, see, that's not Hegel's original idea. Hegel pretty much stole that from Aristotle, and Aristotle stole it from India. That's where the dialectics came from. It's all there. It's a modern rendition of it. It's a good rendition, very complicated and westernized and everything. But that's what it is. You look at that mirror, and you get outside of yourself. This real weird thing that happens psychologically. And you start looking at that image in the mirror. Who is that? And you can kind of like, I'm looking at myself. I can do it without a mirror. I can feel it right now. I feel myself outside myself. If you practice this exercise, and you want to know what a philosopher is? That's what a philosopher is. You look at that mirror, and you're outside, and once you start getting outside that mirror and looking at yourself, that's when it begins. Who we are and what we're about. And it gets into all these nice issues about consciousness, who we are, and all that good stuff. I've really clipped this whole presentation, and I know that, but there it is, examples, blah, blah, where it happens, there you all have examples of why it should, what it shouldn't be, blah, 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 like this, and you can read it just as well as I can, and where we get it in the peer review, what to take away from the presentation, and this is what we put in our paper. You can read it. I'm not going to try to read it because I can't even read the damn thing myself because I'm half blind. There it is, but essentially, you take away the sense of wholeness in terms of the particular. a dialectic. That is the essence of this whole thing. Appreciate that dialectic. When you get outside that mirror and look at yourself, that is the beginning of a dialectic, the conscious dialectic, something in terms of what it isn't. And that's the essence of interdisciplinary study, the particular in terms of the whole in terms of the particular. It's a process, not an object. I want you to keep that in mind, that it's all about the flow, a process. The essence, that's what, I've really clipped this, I've left a lot of stuff out, but there it is. I think you can get the essence of this. There it is.